What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Mindful Muscle podcast for another episode and book review, this time of Ryan Holiday's Stillness Is The Key. And we got Jake Parker here, as always, to help with this book review. Jake, how's it going?
Good, Paul. Happy to be here.
Happy to be here. We are almost through the trinity of Ryan Holiday books. Quick overview of Stillness Is The Key. Obviously, author Ryan Holiday. I completed this initially last summer around July. And for listen time, you got 656, so a little under 7 hours. This one's a little bit longer at 288 pages, released October 1st, 2019. And for me, the readability is similar to how he structures other books. It's actually like really simple. So 8 out of 10 for me. Rating 7 out of 10, a little bit lower, which we'll get into. But what do you think?
I had readability again, 9 out of 10. Again, just to reiterate, I think he's one of the most well-written authors as far as just a lot of flow and readability. But rating, I'll go 9 out of 10. I enjoyed this book. It might even be my favorite out of the three, just because I really resonate with a lot of the spiritual and mindfulness aspects. But yeah, I suppose we'll get into all that as we review the book.
Yeah, I think that was kind of a big thing for me. When we look at the summary, he does it, like to your point, does a really good job of breaking things up. So it's like 3 parts: mind, spirit, body. And so it's very clear, like, here's how you do stillness and slow down for your mind. Here's how it impacts your spirit. Here's how it impacts your body.
Yeah,
And
that and like the eight-ish page chapters is usually about what it seems to work out to. So, and if it's a good feeling of accomplishment whenever you finish a chapter. So it's nice that those aren't like some other books where it's like 30, 40 pages.
yeah, definitely. I think the thing that really stands out to me for this book is almost like he runs out of, not ammunition, because like there's so many things to talk about for stillness, but at the same time, it's stuff that we've all heard before. So like if you look at the name of the chapters, it's become present, limit your input, say no, start journaling, avoid ego, accept a higher power, enter relationships, get rid of your stuff, conquer anger, take a walk, go to sleep, find a hobby, seek solitude. So he's like pulling in what I would call lateral thinking. So like things that are related to stillness and then talking about how you do that in a chapter. And so what it ends up being is essentially like a amalgamation of a bunch of self-help type books or concepts and then pulling them all in to a stoic philosophy lens on stillness. Does that make
Mhm.
sense?
Yeah, definitely. I think the part that I find useful about it is I just don't think that there's ever a point where you can hear this stuff enough. And again, kind of like we talked about with the other two books, the way he talks about these high arching concepts, but then gives specific examples and kind of tells you how to implement them into your life. I think that's useful. And definitely it's one of those books that if you are someone who's prone to like personal development book or self-help book fatigue, definitely there can be some of that here. But I think at the same time, it's always nice to hear these lessons repeated over and over and over, because they really are simple, but they're simple because there's a lot of, like we've said before on the podcast, success leaves clues. So it's just this repeating element of things that really are important and matter. And so I think the more that you can be reminded of that, sometimes that's just what you need.
Yeah. And I know I maybe sounded initially like a little kind of like, oh, it was redundant. It was, a lot like amalgamation of self-help books. But I would also say, if someone were to read this first time and was like really struggling, this would 100% change their life. And even if you know all these concepts and you finally listened to and applied them, it would 100% change your life. So it is your point. It's almost like a book on free throws, bounce passes, and layups, but it's like the profoundness of doing those really well and grasping how important and valuable that is almost what makes it so hard, because people are like, oh yeah, that's obvious, I know that, there needs to be a harder way, right? And then the ego comes in, and it really is just like a good reminder almost of how the little things, or doing nothing, right, and actually practicing stillness is the most important thing that you could be doing.
Yeah. And books, and I think I said this before on one of these review podcasts, but books are so different depending on where you're at in your life or what you need to take from them, what you're currently experiencing, what you're struggling with. Because I think that I can resonate with the way you feel. This is kind of how I felt about ego as the enemy. It's not really, it's something that, not that you can ever master certain things, but ego is something that I don't struggle with as much, whereas stillness is something that I do have more like of a daily struggle with. So I resonate more with a book like this than ego is the enemy. So it really is so context dependent. And I think that's why, again, a good reminder, something that I always try to think about in the context of books, and that is, you have to really capitalize on your excitement about a book and just really read what interests you and what pulls you, because the more you just feel like you have to read a book because it's the thing everybody's reading, or someone important, it was on Steve Jobs 10 best books or whatever, that sort of thinking is what gets you bored with reading really quickly. So I think it's really important to just always remember to read what you're driven to read and what excites you.
Yeah. And I think maybe that's what I'm almost a prisoner of, is I listened to it versus you read it.
Mm-hmm.
So in the way I consumed it, I would have been more on the go. And the
Mm-hmm.
way you would have read it would have been not on the go, slowed
Yeah.
down.
Yeah. Ever since a couple years ago, I stopped listening to audiobooks, mainly just because I have so many podcasts I like to listen to that I didn't really have the time. But the flip side of that too is I think I get a lot more out of books by actually physically reading them, because you can be so much more of a passive observer with listening. So
Yeah. Yeah. The want to get to some of the best quotes, and
yeah.
this one is one that I still come back to, and I remember specifically when I heard it, and I was walking around the lake, South Lake Union in Seattle, and honestly just needed like a mental health day. Like I literally was like, that's it, I'm done. I went and took the rest of the day off and just went for a walk. It was a nice sunny day. And so anyway, as I'm walking and looking at the lake and just trying to slow down, this quote came across my brain. It's something that is just like seared in. So I'll just read it. Who is so talented that they can afford to bring only part of themselves to bear on a problem or opportunity? Whose relationships are so strong that they can get away with not showing up? Who is so certain that they'll get another moment that they can confidently skip over this one? The less energy we waste regretting the past or worrying about the future, the more energy we have for what's in front of us. And so it was like those two where it's like whose relationships are so strong and who is so certain that they'll get another moment. And at that time where I was at, and like that day and that week and that whatever time in my life, I was like, wow, like that was huge, because we just go a million miles an hour assuming that we don't need to give those things the time or the stillness or the focus.
Yeah, definitely. And again, it just speaks to how important it is to take things when you need them. Maybe that's become something that you've more made a part of your regular thought process, but at the time, ideas like that and quotes like that can really just shake the foundation of how you look at your life, how you approach things. And so it speaks to how important a certain quote or a certain passage can be at a certain time in your life when you really need it.
Mm, yeah, definitely. Is there any quotes that stood out to you?
One of my favorites that I wrote down from the first section about the mind and about being present was, in sports, coaches speak about the process, this play, this drill, this rep, not just because this moment is special, but because you can't do your best if your mind is elsewhere. So I think that speaks to, there's a lot of good analogies for sports, because the way that you approach sports, the need to always be getting better and always iterating, is something that resonates a lot with business, with health, with anything that we're into. So I love the aspect of, you only have the present moment, and you can get too caught up in thinking about what's my end goal in X number of months or X number of years, or even on a smaller scale, what am I going to do after this workout, what's the next exercise I'm going to do. But when you are constantly thinking in that way, you're constantly getting lost, and you're never really going to truly experience things as they are. So that's something that I try to practice a lot in my life, even though it's one of the most difficult things, just trying to cultivate being present.
Yeah. And it's so funny too. I was just talking about, he uses a lot of sports analogies and metaphors in this book. And I was just talking about bounce passes and layups and free throws. And then your first quote is the process and coaches just hammering that. And I was, as you were talking about that, I was picturing like Kobe Bryant for some reason. And he's someone that would totally have grasped that concept. And obviously, that's what made him one of the greatest basketball players and greatest athletes of all time. And so, grasping this concept is ultimately, and applying it is ultimately what makes people great.
Yeah. And
It's
and another one of the oldest cliches is that, success is the journey and not the destination. And one of the notes I made about the spirit section is I just put, "I'll be happy when." So I was just reminded about how often we can think, once I reach my fitness goal, then I'm going to be happy. Or once I get this next promotion at my job, then I'll be happy. We're always saving satisfaction for a later point in life, or that can happen a lot with setting goals, with striving towards goals, which I think is a great thing. I think everybody should have goals, but I think it's also really important to realize, as much as you can, this moment is enough. And just being invested in every moment in your life is a way that you build a satisfactory life. You can't always be looking for the next thing or hungry for the next thing, because it's going to lead you to be anxious and probably disappointed in the long term when you realize that whatever that goal was is not going to be what makes you happy. Just being invested in the day-to-day process of things is going to be what makes you happy.
Yeah. What you were saying actually just kind of reminded me of just like almost like a movie, right? Everyone wants to get to the end. They want to get
Mm-hmm.
to the destination, but the joy of a movie is watching the movie, not the end scene or the end credits. Like, sure, that might be great in that time, but that only has value because of what happened during the movie. And
Mm-hmm.
so I don't know if that lands for anyone or even if it lands for you, but it's like the fun part of watching a sports game is the game, not the end of it, right? And it's almost like people are so eager to hit their goals, and I'll put myself in this bucket. It's like you're so eager to hit your goals that you miss out on the journey. And it would be like, oh, I can't wait to watch the highlight reel or the end sports center recap of the game. And it's like, well, you had the game that you could have watched the entire time and just been present during the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that another good analogy or example is, it wouldn't feel as good to be given $1 million as it would be to earn it over the course of a career. And of course, like a lot of people would say, well, sure, I'll take $1 million. And of course, we all would. But I think that there's just so much to be learned from going through something, setting hard goals, reaching goals. I think another even more direct analogy is with your fitness. Like a lot of people want to, have abs, or have, like our last Q&A was about getting a bicep vein or whatever. People get very hyper fixated on one specific goal. And not that that's necessarily bad. Like I said, it is good to have goals and chase after goals. But what's a lot more satisfactory than reaching the goal is the process of having to be disciplined every day in order to reach that goal.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Any
And
other quotes that you wrote down?
a couple, yeah. And this was actually one that I heard initially in my yoga teacher training when I was becoming a yoga instructor. And this, I can specifically think of the Instagram post that I made with this basically quote as the caption. And at the time, I thought like this is the most profound thing anyone on the planet said. Maybe I was a little bit ego, but anyway, I'll get into it. So it basically says all of humanity's problems, Blaise Pascal said in 1654, stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. And again, to your point, it's like maybe it just hits you at where you're at, but if I were to take your phone away and take not yours, I'm talking to a listener on this on the podcast. If I were to take your phone away, you had to sit in the room alone, no TV, no music, no anything, and you just had to sit there. Like that would be torture for some people. Like that would
Mm-hmm.
be enough for someone to start screaming and being like, "This is the worst thing ever." The anxiety would go through the roof, and it's like all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. And for me, what that means is we are so unhappy being with ourselves that we will do anything to not do that.
Have you ever heard of I want to call it like an experiment, I guess, but I must have just heard about this in a couple podcasts where essentially a group of researchers put people alone in a room, and they say you can either be alone in a room, or you have this button that you can use to shock yourself. And a lot of people would choose to just shock themselves, which is like a painful experience, just because they get so bored and they want to feel something.
Hmm.
So it just speaks to, if you don't try to acquire stillness and you don't create that for yourself, there is a lot of people who will choose any sort of emotion or any sort of feeling over just feeling nothing and being alone with their thoughts. And that's kind of what, on a broader scale, people will do with their lives. So, in the context of, oh, everything's going well, I have, a girlfriend or boyfriend, I have a job, I have hobbies, whatever. And if you haven't cultivated stillness when things are going really well and going in a good direction, you might subconsciously create negative things in your life. You might sabotage yourself in a relationship. You might turn to drugs and alcohol, whatever that might look like. If you don't have an inner fortress that's strong, you're going to be so much more likely to let negative things into your life just because some stimulus feels better than none.
Yeah. There's a couple quotes that I are kind of random ones that I have in my life that tie directly to this. So there's a Taylor Swift song where she says, I start a fight because I need to feel something, which is exactly kind of what you were talking about. And I wanted to just bring in examples of how people literally do this and why, when he says all of humanity's problems, and that sounds kind of like broad and just like a platitude, and it's like, is that really true? But there's the quote from this song, I start a fight because I need to feel something. So it's like, okay, everything's going well. You don't feel any kind of like extreme emotion or extreme stimulus. So you create one, right? So you sabotage and create a problem. How many times have you or I or anyone listening to this podcast been sitting there bored and maybe they just go to the pantry because they need to have something in their hands? Or when you go to a bar, a lot of people will be like, I need a drink in my hand
For
in
sure.
order
Yeah.
to not feel weird. So again, all of our problems come from needing to have something so that we don't have to sit with not having a drink in our hand, so that we don't have to sit next to our significant other and just let it be. Like we got to create a problem. We got to create, a drink in our hand because we can't bear to be doing nothing.
And I think, like, to just get really deep with it for a second, I think that you're probably familiar with like the Jungarian psychology, where basically Carl Jung talked about the iceberg theory, where what we see of a person, the top of the iceberg is pales in comparison to to the total iceberg, which is mostly under the water. So the subconscious things about people that we don't see. And I think a lot of times people create havoc in their life or introduce bad things because because of something that happened in their life, or something where they became stunted in their growth, or some negative experience that happened, whatever it is. A lot of times people have an inherent subconscious sense of feeling unworthy. And so then when things are going really well, they almost feel this need for, oh, something has to go bad because I'm not worthy of all these things going right. So I think it just speaks to how important having a healthy self-esteem is. And that's part of the stillness aspect too. Like Ryan talks a lot about that. He alludes to things that are in the self-esteem category, but it's just, you can reason with your mind, but if you have subconscious desires and subconscious feelings of unworthiness because of something that happened in the past in your life, you might create problems and not understand why. It kind of reminds me of there's the whole chapter where Ryan writes about Tiger Woods, and he's on top of the world, right? He's one of the most winning golfers, one of the most winning athletes of all time, but he can't help but self-sabotage with all these women that he brings into his life, even though he has a happy marriage and kids. And that probably stems from all the turmoil that his dad introduced into his life. And that's kind of what he saw as, I guess, maybe what it means to be a man. And because he never rewrote a new story for himself, he fell into that same stuff that his dad fell into.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. It's, there's one other thing I was going to say in regards to what we were talking about, but it's escaping me. So we can just
Well,
jump into, is there any,
it
yeah,
feeds
keep going.
into another one of the quotes that I wrote down, which is, you can't escape with your body problems that exist in your mind and soul. You can't run away from your choices. You can only fix them with better choices. So again, I think again that's a good leeway into just speaking about vice. Like, I drink sometimes. I have certain vices that I don't think are bad if kept in perspective. But again, how easy is it to, someone who's famous or very successful, they have so much more of a propensity towards womanizing or drinking too much, becoming an alcoholic, getting into drugs, because oftentimes that escape is what we gravitate towards when things are going well again, and you need to find some form of escapism.
Yeah, and that was actually one of the chapters that he had, and one of the ones that I wrote down, because a lot of what we do is to escape this feeling of ultimately uncertainty. And
And even if it's not like drugs or alcohol, like there's sometimes people categorize themselves as okay because it's like, oh well, I don't use drugs, I don't use alcohol, but there's things like video games, porn, like things that you don't have to judge and call bad necessarily on their face, but obviously can be very addictive and can be abused. So
yeah, no, totally. It was something I heard from a comedian actually on a podcast one time, where I think it was Theo Vaughn, but he was saying he was so anxious about what people thought that he would make people laugh, because at least if they were laughing and smiling, he knew where they stood. And so like, I don't know if you've ever heard that from the angle of comedy, but it's like to have a conversation with someone and they're looking at you stone cold face, and in a way it's like, I don't know there's nothing happening, right? There's no reaction, no emotion. So I need to create one. So at least I know where I stand, right? Like
mhm.
Taylor Swift, I start a fight because I need to feel something. So that was the one last thing that I just wanted to, I don't know, throw out there and see if that's anything you've ever run
Yeah.
across
I
as a
mean,
comedian or
what comes
seen.
to mind, what comes to mind as a comedian, the thing that's interesting and that maybe people realize or maybe people don't is that oftentimes comedians are some of the most depressed and anxious people. And they kind of just get to look at the voices in their head and extrapolate what they're saying in a way that's funny because everybody has anxieties and things that upset them. And sometimes the people that feel those the most are the best at fleshing them out and making them into something coherent and thoughtful. And in the case of a comedian, funny. And something else that I find interesting, and I believe this is something I heard from Whitney Cummings, who's a really funny female comedian. She was talking about the fact that a lot of comedians think that their life has to just be kind of screwed up, like because that's what makes them funny. They're inherently broken, or they're out of shape, or they can't have a happy relationship, or they're broke or whatever. And a lot of comedians think that whatever turmoil in their life that they joke about is what makes them funny. And that can be true to some extent, but I think that there's a fear among comedians of, I don't want to heal myself because then I'm not going to be funny anymore. But, and I think that this is something that Ryan kind of speaks to also in the book. I think we still have what inherently makes us us in the case of a comedian being funny, even when we heal ourselves, even when we make good habits for ourselves, and maybe even more so. Maybe you're achieving success, again, just keep it in the realm of a comedian. Maybe you're funny despite being broken, and you can really unlock a new part of yourself if you do form good habits and do fix the things that are unsatisfactory in your life.
Yeah. And I think you could totally make fun of someone for eating a celery stick at Buffalo Wild Wings the same way you
Mm-hmm.
could for them putting the entire jar of sauce on their Buffalo Wild Wings. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? It's just like hit the beats, good writing, and you're gonna be totally fine.
Mm-hmm.
I want to touch on this one last quote that I had for me, and then we can wrap it up with just overall takeaways and highlights. And it was an Epictetus quote, where he says, "If you wish to approve, be content to appear clueless or stupid in extraneous matters." Which for me just comes down to like, you got to be okay failing and not being good at something if you wish to get anywhere really in life.
Yeah. I had one that was similar. The third quote that I wrote down was, it's not enough to be inclined toward deep thought and sober analysis. A leader must create time and space for it. So that kind of speaks to, like your quote speaks to, you can't be invested in everything. You can't know every single breaking news story and every single piece of celebrity gossip. If you want to really thrive in whatever it is that you care about, whether it be your career, your health, your family life, and it's probably a combination of those things, you have to get really clear about your priorities and divorce yourself from the things that are unimportant. And again, that last sentence or the last piece of my quote is what resonates the most with me. A leader must create time and space for it. So I mean, how many people use the excuse of, I don't have time for this, for XYZ? Health is obviously a good example. I don't have time to eat healthy. I don't have time to exercise. But you have to create time and you have to create space for the things that are really important. They're not going to just fall in your lap, but they are attainable and they are reachable if you really get clear about why you want that and how you're going to go about getting that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. You have to create the time. I was having a conversation with someone the other day, and they're like, "Hey, can you just tell me what the price of the program is? I don't want to waste any of our time." And it's like, lady, like we obviously have something that we can work on together. Like, if you don't have 30 minutes to have a conversation to solve this problem, how are you going to carve out 30 minutes or 45 minutes to work out an exercise to fix this problem that sounds like it's pretty big? And, it's just one of those things where we buy into this story and then we hold on to it so true. And it's like, if you fight for your limitations, guess what? You get to keep them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that one of the things that I most think about in the mind aspect too, the first section of the book is he kind of alludes to the power of the low information diet, which I think is a phrase I first got from the 4 Hour Work Week, which I know we've
Yeah.
talked about reviewing on the podcast. I love that book, but just only taking in information that's relevant to you. And again, it's so hard in the day of I can access any news I want at any time. Obviously, social media is a constant barrage of news and information, and sometimes that fills a hole where we feel satisfied and we feel like we're making progress because we have so much coming in. But if you don't have some sort of output or something that you're working on, creating, improving, that is going to lead to some unsatisfactoriness overall, even though it feels like things are happening in our life just because there's such a barrage of information at all times.
Yeah. I think that's something that over the course of my life, I've spent a lot of, I don't know if I want to say focus, but I've seen a big progression, and I'll just give like a really tangible example. When Russell Wilson threw the interception against the Patriots in the Super Bowl, it ruined the next like 2 days for me. Like literally,
Mm-hmm.
especially that evening. I remember going grocery shopping, and I like had to, and it was like I was like head buried in the grocery cart the entire way down. And for the next 2 days, I had work Monday, Tuesday. I watched that play 1,000 times on YouTube. If someone would have said, "Hey, Paul, we have a deadline on Wednesday," wouldn't have hit it. And it was like I was so wrapped up in this information and this news about someone that it was a quarterback from the city I was from, but it wasn't anything like specific to my life and ultimately information I didn't need to know. Uh, Fast forward to a couple days ago, like he gets, I think, traded to the
Mm-hmm.
Broncos.
Broncos, yeah.
I didn't consume a single piece of that content. Like I saw it across my social media feed, but it's just like I've I went from like being so wrapped up into information about sports and other athletes and what other news, like right, it could be Kim Kardashian, it could be sports, it could be what's going on, in the war in Ukraine. And I guess I'm saying this to help people understand like you can move and progress because I've seen this progression in my own life to where I'm like I think I follow CBS Sports and like that's it. And so
Mm-hmm.
I'll catch the news, but I 0% have any desire to go and spend a ton of time and energy as to like what the latest trade rumors are or what the speculation is on Tom Brady. Like I saw yesterday he came back. That's great. Good
Mm-hmm.
for him. Right? And this is maybe like my rigid flipping of how I approach things and there's a happy medium with this, but I used to be so invested in athletes and what was going on and is my sports team or my college team the best? And now I've peeled back to be like these guys don't watch me. They don't watch my podcast. They're not invested in what I do, and they're not going to lose any sleep if I have a bad coaching call or anything
Mm-hmm.
with a client. And so it's like unless it's an athlete or a friend or someone and you're just like invested because you want what's best for them, we're really getting invested in these people that how they perform has no impact on our lives or how what's going on in social media literally has no impact on your lives. You still have your relationships, you still have your job, you still have your finances, you still have your health, irregardless of Kim Kardashian and Kanye breaking up, irregardless of the news, the rumors, the speculation. And if you can just cut that, say no, limit your inputs, you now free up so much more time and space to go and do things that are impactful in your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what season was that they played the Patriots in the Super Bowl? Like 2017, maybe?
No, I want to say it was like 2015.
Okay, so I guess my point being, like, I bet you couldn't even remember one other game that happened that year. And that's the interesting thing with sports. Like, you watch ESPN, you watch the 24-hour news cycle for ESPN or whatever sports outlet. There's always going to be a new thing that they're talking about. They're always going to have some interesting headlines. But 1 year from now, let alone 3, 4, 5 years from now, you're not going to remember what was going on. You might remember the Super Bowl champion, you might remember a play or two, but it's all so ephemeral. And I think something that you'd be better spent giving your time towards is, like, I can remember takeaways from a book I read 5 years ago that always stuck with me and that changed the way I think about things. So really trying to prioritize long-term gratification and not getting caught up in the things that you're not going to remember a year from now, let alone a month from now,
Yeah.
even though they are very attention grabbing in the moment, trying to think beyond that.
Yeah. And I think it kind of brings in a bunch of different elements to this book. I wrote down limit your inputs, cultivate silence, say no, seek solitude. It was funny because those are kind of saying the same things, but in different parts. Whereas I think it was the mind and the body. So it's basically saying like have boundaries and slow down and get away from people. And so it works for the mind, it works for the body as well. But I think what is so profound about the stuff that is being talked about is that majority, I don't want to throw everyone, but we'll just say 90% of the population exists on the spectrum of too much, too fast, no clarity on what's going on in their life. And they need a book like this and practices within this book to slide on the spectrum of having a little bit more balance of being able to slow down, being able to speed up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a lot of, I feel like tons of people that I look up to have some sort of quote around saying no. So, for example, I know that Steve Jobs has a quote that's something like, success is saying no. There's a Warren Buffett quote I know almost off the top of my head where he says, the difference between successful people and very successful people is very successful people say no to almost everything. So, that's another really important thing to remember too, and not feeling some sense of guilt or obligation towards things that really don't matter. So, a good example from my life is, there's friends of mine that maybe are likely to go and have drinks, have a happy hour on Friday. And if there's a Friday afternoon when I haven't got, enough, not enough is not the right word because that creates a whole mindset shift. But if there's a workout I want to do on a Friday evening that I've been planning, I'm going to find it easy to say no to that happy hour because I have my priorities. But the more easily you're swayed by different influences, the easier it's going to be to let go of those higher priorities. So I think for me, and you got to find out what works for you, but for me, having things in my schedule, having hard priorities for a week, like 4 workouts, like reading for an hour a day, stuff like that. Having it's almost like in nutrition, I think something that I've been focused on more in the last couple of years is a lot of times it's more about what can you add than what can you take away. So can you add more high protein foods? Can you add more vegetables to your diet? That's going to inherently limit the extra processed food and high calorie food you're going to take in. So with your life, can you add more reading books, joining book clubs, taking workout classes, stuff like that? And then you're inherently going to have less time for those activities like watching Netflix, like going to happy hour with your friends. So really just thinking about, obviously saying no is important, but I think some extra ammunition for saying no is be very involved in things that are important and that matter to you so that you have an excuse to say no to things that don't matter.
Yeah. And I think to your point, it's like if you do enjoy spending quality time with your significant other, watching a TV show, and that's how you guys communicate love languages, let's just use this as an example, like do that, but have it be intentional and have it be something that like you guys are actually wanting to do as opposed to just default mode finding yourself on the couch watching Netflix for the seventh time this
Yeah,
week. And it's
definitely.
interesting, the quote that you had reminded me of one that is almost the exact same quote just through the lens of a baseball player. So Barry, I think it was Barry Bonds, maybe it wasn't, but they're basically saying the difference between a a bench player and a starter is what they swing at. The difference between a starter and an all-star is what they swing at. The difference between an all-star and a Hall of Famer is what they swing at. So in order to choose yes to swing at something, you have to say no to a lot of balls in the dirt, to a lot of fastballs up and in. And that's ultimately what you're talking about with Warren Buffett, where it's like It's not what you say yes to, it's your ability to say no to things that are not going to help you get the best result. Fastball down the middle, it's going to help you get the best result. Working on your business or working on the most important work project, going to help you get the best result. In Warren Buffett's case, I'm sure it's investing in the S&P 500. That's going to help you get the best result. You know what I'm
Mm-hmm.
saying? And so it's like it's saying no to all these attempts. A pitcher wants you to give it a swing. Someone wants you to give you their time. Someone wants you to have a side project at your job that makes their life easier, but is no obligation to you. And so it's just like say no and be
Yeah,
okay saying no and being still. That's the other part of this book.
mm-hmm. You and I both like the hell yes or no paradigm too, where if you say yes to everything that just sounds okay, like, yeah, sure, that sounds all right, I'll do it. The more you say yes to those things, you fill up your calendar with stuff that you're not really excited about. So then when the one home run opportunity comes in, you can't say yes to that because you've said yes to so many things that are just average opportunities that you don't really care about. So I think that speaking about Warren Buffett again, he's one person I really look up to. And I know of an interview I watched of his one time where he's showing the interviewer his calendar, and he goes, "I can't believe." The interviewer goes, "I can't believe this. It's just a bunch of empty spaces." And he's like, "Yeah, I spend a lot of time thinking and reflecting and reading, and I have an empty calendar so that when huge home run opportunities come up, I can say yes right away and I can give them priority."
Mm.
Um,
I'm gonna go clear
but
my calendar.
yeah,
See if it
but
makes me a billionaire.
another another really interesting concept too to me is, like you said, with watching Netflix or whatever with your significant other. I think that something that I changed my mind on in the last few years is not just doing leisure activities just because they're there. So for example, I don't really watch a lot of football anymore. I used to watch a lot of football in college just because that's what my friends did and that's what the guys that I knew did, but it never really excited me. Whereas now, like, I'm really into movies. It might actually get me really excited to watch a brand new movie that I've been excited about watching and have that take 3 hours out of my weekend versus watching 3 hours of a football game I'm not really going to care about. So, not judging yourself as wasting your time if something matters to you and gets you excited, but also not just, again, saying yes to anything just because it's there, you know?
Yeah.
So, being intentional about your priorities and the things that are really moving the ball, but also being intentional about your leisure time and your relaxation. Like the last part of the Stillness is the Key, he talks a lot about relaxation. And I think that that's important. And it's important to be active about your, I try to be as active about my relaxation as I am about my priorities and my work and my health. And just active in the sense that I want to do things that sound fun and that I'm looking forward to doing. Like I love to take a couple hours out of my week in the summer to golf, and that gets me excited, and I love doing that. But I think that if you're passive about your leisure time, and again, you just sit on the couch and watch a series you've watched 6 times, and it's not that enjoyable to you, you're not going to feel as refreshed as you would from doing a leisure activity that you're really excited about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All good stuff, man. It's like to your point that I don't have time. It's like you have time for whatever you carve out for. And for Warren Buffett, if you say no to a bunch of things, you got way more time, way
Mm-hmm.
more energy.
Yeah. And the last thing I would point to, the other thing that I wanted to point out from the book is he makes a lot of allusions to worrying. And I always try to remember that worrying essentially just makes you suffer twice. Even if the thing you're worrying about does happen, what good did it do to worry about it if you can't change it? Again, this is something that speaks very personally to me because I've always been a worrier. I feel like knowing my mom and my grandma, I come from a long line of worriers, but I always try to remember that you if you can't change something, then just let it go. But if you can, obviously take action steps towards making whatever thing you're anxious about better. Dialing in more the positive outcome you want out of something, but trying not to just become hyper fixated on something and let it ruminate in your head if you're not actively able to change it in any way.
Yeah, I love that. Worrying makes you suffer twice, and probably more than twice. Dude, I went into this book review being like, is there as much? But I feel like the as much in terms of like what we went over with the other books. And again, maybe this totally changes if we do Stillness is the Key first and Ego is the Enemy last. And it's just kind of the fact that it got this third one. But I think the way to think about this book is like it's so profound because it's so simple. And don't
Mm-hmm.
let the simplicity of stillness just get walked over because it seems like it's not important when it ultimately is the most important thing.
Yeah. It's the key, for lack of a better word.
Hey, there we go. Bringing it in. Awesome. Well, guys, thank you so much for listening to this book review of Stillness is the Key by Ryan Holiday. Few housekeeping things before we sign off. And I don't actually ask for this a ton, but I'd appreciate if you could leave a 5-star rating and review on the podcast. It helps me grow the podcast so that when people come to the page or come to the podcast home section and they see all these 5-star ratings, or they see this 4.7 or 4.8 or 4.9, that would be amazing. Then they're more inclined to listen to it. They're more inclined to get the content. They're more inclined, or they're more likely to start changing the way they live their lives and start improving their lives. So you are directly related to people getting better and
Yeah.
helping us grow the podcast. So I appreciate that. And then the two last housekeeping things that we always do, Mindful Muscle Facebook group. There is a link to that in the description. You can get all of this content, plus be able to ask questions and engage with the community. We've got a Mindful Muscle mini course that we've created for you guys to check out so that you can learn things and deep dive on your training, nutrition. We got a macro manual, the 3 pillars of mindfulness, and a ton of other trainings around the metabolism. So to help you get better with your fitness. And then if you're in the Seattle area, you've got the Fuller Nutrifuel. I'll get better at saying that. .com. You can get a 15% off discount on meal prep delivered to your door. Delicious, nutritious, uh, just amazing, time saving, money saving, because the average DoorDash order is $39 and this average meal is going to be $12. It's going to save you time. It's going to save you money. It's going to save you focus. I actually got a testimonial from a client. He said that he has had the cleanest house and kitchen and more free time than he's ever had the last few weeks doing the meal service, because he no longer has to spend the time cooking after work, and it's freed up and been this linchpin to so many things in his day. And so, like, when you take things off your plate, you have more time, more space, and energy. Allow this to take that off your plate. You can use the code Paul15 for 15% off your first order, and then Paul10 for 10% off all future orders. And Jake, is there anything I missed?
The only thing I would add is if you're really dying to hear about a specific book, be sure to let Paul or I know. You can always DM us on Instagram. But no, another successful book review podcast
Yep.
in the books.
Yep. And in the show notes, we got linked to coaching if you are interested in the E4 Fit method and going through the program with Jake and I. We are more than happy to walk you through and guide you on your fitness journey. But other than that, Jake, thanks for being on this podcast with me, and we'll catch you guys next time on the Mindful Muscle podcast.
Thanks, guys.